In this video, we are going to talk about domestic abuse, and I'm going to give a list of things that if your boyfriend or husband does, he could potentially end up abusing you or your children. And I was in a mentally and physically abusive marriage to the extent that my ex-husband took my daughter's life. So some of this is just my personal experience, and I'm not claiming to be an expert. So number one, did he have aggressive or, anger issues as a young child? So, think about how his parents describe him as a child. So, like for me, my ex-mother-in-law would talk about how they would call my ex-husband the Hulk whenever he was younger because he would go into these rages. And at the time, I thought it was funny, a joke. Later on, I realized that it was a red flag, and they made it into a joke. And so she also talked about having to replace his bedroom doors and, because of him punching and destroying the doors. And so there was also a time that the neighbors called the police on him because he was in a rage and was shooting a gun out of his bedroom window. So looking back, I can see how those things were not okay, not normal. But in the moment, I thought that he had changed. I believed him when he said he changed and was no longer that person. So I was wrong, of course, but those were a few things that I should have, thought more into. And number two, being overly controlling. So this could start out small, like wanting to know exactly where you are at all times, or even like driving by where you say you are just to make sure that you're actually there. And so the first time that I noticed this in my relationship was when I was hanging out with my friends, from high school, because I had just graduated high school at the time of this relationship. And then my ex-husband said, if my dad sees you with other guys, he's going to think bad things about you. And so he was trying to manipulate me and make it seem like that he cared so much about me that he didn't want his dad, to think badly of me. When now I can look back and see that I was doing nothing wrong, and that was all him just wanting to control me. And so over time this got worse. So for example, a few years into our marriage, I couldn't watch really anything on TV without his permission. He constantly tried to control me through money by, first of all, keeping a separate bank account and not allowing me to have any of the money unless I did whatever he wanted for me to do to be able to get it. So these things started out small, and then eventually they got to the point of controlling everything. So number three, a past use of drugs, a current use of drugs or alcohol and addictions. And so I'm not saying this is always the case, but from my experience, as soon as I found out that my ex had a history of drugs, I should have just ran the other way. I shouldn't have, I should have took that as a red flag. And I was naive, and I allowed him to make up this story about how he overcame his addiction and was a changed man. And so I know that happens, but in this case, no. So he still drank as a way to cope with life, and I knew nothing about those things because until that point, I had never really been exposed to drug and alcohol use, especially, the level that he was using them. And so I believed his story of him changing, and he may have changed for a short time, but throughout our marriage, I caught him with pills and even meth. And so it 100% added to the abuse, and I think it was probably, I think he was using drugs and drinking whenever he shook our 3-month-old daughter. And so when considering if someone could be, potentially abusive, I believe that being under the influence of things like that can definitely put people at risk. So number four, mood changes that seem to come out of nowhere. So I noticed this in my own experience when my ex would be totally fine and then shift in an instant. So something very small could trigger anger or even crying from him. And so sometimes there didn't even even seem to be a cause. And so a good example is, do they come home from work with raging anger over something that's not really that big of a deal? So, my ex-husband would come home angry, at the manager at his job. And all he did from his perspective, was like smart off to him or just being him. And I mean, he'd be fine 1 minute and then like pissed about his coworker the next minute. And he even drove by this guy's home one evening throwing beer bottles at his house. So, you know, another example is we'd be sitting at home like watching TV, everything seemed fine, and then he'd be upset just out of nowhere. And so that's a red flag for sure. Number 5, low self-worth or self-esteem. So we all struggle with that at some point, but there's a difference when it's just doubting yourself a little bit and then, you know, basically talking bad about yourself constantly and doing anything possible for compliments. To me, that's a red flag. In my experience, it was, you know, obvious now looking back that my ex-husband had very low self-esteem. And so, for example, he would talk badly about himself and then expect me to say the opposite and reassure him, and then he would do nothing at all to change any of those things. And so he thrived off of compliments, and he would do just about anything, you know, around anyone to get a compliment. And it's like he had this high when someone, you know, like especially a female, complimented him. And so I don't mean just like a wow, thank you, and move on. It's more like you could almost physically, you know, see and feel the boost in ego. And then it wouldn't take long for the crash to come. So this becomes dangerous whenever, you know, to boost their own self-esteem, they have to put you down. And you can't be in the spotlight, you can't shine at all, because they see that as you dimming their light or trying to be better than them. And, you know, they take it as you degrading them just by you getting compliments and stuff. And so in reality, that's not true, but because they have such a low self-esteem, they see it from a messed up, selfish perspective, and it can turn into abusing you to make them feel better. So, you know, I share this information because if I had been aware of this at a younger age, I could have possibly avoided getting into an abusive marriage, and I also wouldn't be the mother of a child who was shaken, who now lives in heaven. And so you can find my full shaken baby syndrome story in the book I wrote, Going Through Trials with God, 7 Lessons Learned Through Shaken Baby Syndrome, on Amazon or Audible. But, you know, that is why I share this information, because I wish I knew these things. I'm not saying that just because they do these things, they will abuse you. But these are the things that I noticed that if I had been aware of then, I could have possibly prevented getting in a relationship like that and getting into a marriage and all of these things. So that's why I share this. Feel free to share this video with whoever you think may need to see it. And I look forward to seeing you on my next video.